The wolves were closing in, and Eliza Crow had a choice: hide like the worthless girl her mother always claimed she was, or stand in the blizzard and fight. 6 months ago, she'd been thrown away in the mud of a mining town, sold for the price of a horse to a scarred stranger everyone feared. Now, with a rifle in her trembling hands and death circling in the darkness, she was about to discover what she was truly made of. This is the story of a woman who clawed her way from nothing to everything. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eliza's journey reaches. The mud of Iron Ridge, Wyoming territory sucked at Eliza Crow's worn boots as her mother shoved her forward into the center of the settlement's main street. It was October 1874, and the first serious cold of the season had turned the ground into a freezing slurry that seemed eager to swallow whatever dignity Eliza had left. "Here she is," Margaret Crow announced to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying that particular blend of bitterness and relief that Eliza had known her entire 20 years. "Strong enough to work, quiet enough not to cause trouble. Someone take her off my hands before winter sets in proper." Eliza stood there, shivering in a dress that had been mended so many times it was more thread than fabric, her dark hair hanging limp around a face that had learned early never to show what it felt. Around her, the people of Iron Ridge, miners, merchants, drifters, and opportunists, regarded her with the same dispassionate interest they might show a horse being sold at auction. "What's wrong with her?" called out a bearded man in a leather apron, the blacksmith whose name Eliza had never learned. "Nothing's wrong with her," Margaret snapped, though her tone suggested otherwise. She eats more than she's worth is all. Winter's coming, and I've got younger mouths to feed." It wasn't true, of course. Margaret had no other children. But the truth had never been an obstacle to her mother's narrative. Eliza was simply the mistake that had cost Margaret Crow her husband, her reputation, and her chance at whatever better life she'd imagined for herself. Never mind that Eliza's father had been the one to abandon them when Eliza was 3. Never mind that Margaret's drinking had cost them more homes and opportunities than Eliza could count. In her mother's story, Eliza was the villain, and after 20 years of hearing it, part of Eliza had started to believe it. "How much?" This from a thick-necked man Eliza recognized as one of the mine foremen, a man whose hands wandered and whose breath always smelled of whiskey. Margaret's eyes lit up with mercenary interest. "What are you offering?" "Depends on what I'm getting." The foreman stepped closer, circling Eliza like a buyer examining livestock. She kept her eyes fixed on the mountains in the distance, their peaks already white with early snow. "She know how to cook? Clean? Keep a house?" "She can learn whatever needs learning," Margaret said quickly. "She's obedient enough." Eliza felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. Obedient. As if she'd ever had a choice. "I'll give you $10, the foreman said. "She can work in my cabin, keep it clean, warm my bed when it's cold." The words hung in the air, their meaning perfectly clear. Around them, the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. This was the frontier, after all. People did what they needed to survive, and if a worthless girl was being traded for the price of winter supplies, well, that was just the way of things. Margaret was already nodding, reaching out for the money, when a voice cut through the cold air like a blade. 20. The crowd turned as one. Eliza's gaze followed, though she kept her head down, a lifetime of self-preservation making her small and unnoticed. The man who had spoken stood at the edge of the crowd, half in shadow. He was tall, taller than anyone else present, and built with the lean, dangerous muscle of someone who survived by strength and skill rather than luck. His face was weathered beyond his years, which Eliza guessed to be somewhere in his mid-30s, and a vicious scar ran from his left temple down through his cheekbone, pulling at the corner of his eye in a way that made him look perpetually fierce. Silas Vane. Even Eliza, who kept to herself and avoided the gossip of the settlement, knew that name. He was a legend of sorts in the high country, a mountain man who came down from his isolated cabin only a few times a year for supplies, trading pelts, and medicinal herbs for flour, coffee, ammunition, and little else. Stories about him varied wildly. Some said he'd been a soldier who'd gone mad from the things he'd seen. Others claimed he'd murdered a man in a duel back east and fled to the wilderness to escape the law. A few whispered that he'd lost his family to Arapaho raiders and had sworn off human company forever. Whatever the truth, Silas Vane was feared. He moved through the settlement like a ghost when he appeared, spoke to no one, and left no trace of his passage beyond the furs he traded and the unsettling feeling his presence created. The foreman's face had gone red. "You can't just—" $20, Silas repeated, his voice carrying that quiet authority that didn't need volume to command attention. $20 for the girl, and I take her now. Margaret's greed warred briefly with her fear of the mountain man, but greed won, as it always did. $20, and she's yours. No returns, no complaints. I don't make complaints. Silas stepped forward, and the crowd parted like water around stone. He was dressed for the mountains, leather and wool, practical and worn, with a rifle slung over one shoulder and a knife at his belt that looked more like a small sword. His eyes, Eliza noticed, were a startling pale gray, like ice over deep water. He counted out $20 in silver coins, each one clinking into Margaret's eager palm with a sound that felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Eliza's coffin, perhaps. Everyone knew what happened to women who went into the mountains with men like Silas Vane. They were never seen again. "Take whatever you own," Silas said, looking at Eliza directly for the first time. "We leave in 5 minutes." Eliza nodded mutely. Everything she owned could fit in a canvas sack. 2 dresses, a threadbare coat, a hairbrush missing half its bristles, and a book of poetry her father had given her before he'd left. It took her less than 3 minutes to gather it all from the lean-to behind the boarding house where she and her mother had been staying. When she returned to the street, Margaret was already disappearing into the saloon, the silver jingling in her pocket. She didn't look back. She never did. Silas was waiting with a mule loaded with supplies and a horse that looked as lean and dangerous as its rider. He handed Eliza a wool blanket without a word, then gestured for her to follow. The climb out of Iron Ridge began immediately, the trail rising sharply from the valley floor toward the high peaks. Eliza kept pace as best she could, her inadequate boots slipping on the loose rocks, her breath coming in gasps as the altitude began to affect her. She'd lived her whole life in mining camps and settlements, never more than a few hundred feet above the valley floors. This was different. This was the real wilderness, where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall, where winter killed without mercy, and where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was. They walked for hours without speaking. Silas set a brutal pace, never looking back to see if she was keeping up. Eliza gritted her teeth and followed, refusing to complain, refusing to fall behind. She didn't know what awaited her at the end of this climb, but she'd be damned if she'd give this silent stranger the satisfaction of seeing her weak. The sun was setting when they finally stopped. They'd climbed so high that Iron Ridge was just a smudge of smoke and shadow in the valley far below. The air was thin and cold enough to make Eliza's lungs ache with each breath. Silas began making camp with practiced efficiency, building a small fire in a sheltered spot between 2 massive boulders. He threw Eliza the wool blanket he'd given her earlier. "Wrap up. Temperature drops fast up here." She obeyed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, and it was warmer than anything she'd owned in years. "There's dried meat in the pack," Silas continued, not looking at her as he worked. "And hardtack. Eat what you need." Eliza found the food and ate sparingly, not sure what the rules were, not sure if this was some kind of test. The dried meat was tough and salty, but it was protein, and her empty stomach welcomed it gratefully. When the fire was crackling steadily, Silas finally sat down across from her. The flames cast dancing shadows across his scarred face, making him look even more forbidding. "I'm going to explain this once," he said, his voice as rough and uncompromising as the mountains around them. "I didn't buy you. I paid your mother to stop abusing you. There's a difference." Eliza blinked, shocked into silence. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't that. "You'll work at my cabin," Silas continued. "I need help with the daily tasks: cooking, cleaning, preserving meat, tanning hides, maintaining equipment. In exchange, you'll have shelter, food, and safety. You'll learn how to survive up here, because if something happens to me, you'll need to know how to make it through a winter alone." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "I have 3 rules. First, you do the work you're given. I won't accept laziness, but I won't demand the impossible either. Second, You don't steal from me. There's no law up here except what we make, and I won't tolerate a thief. Third, you don't lie to me. I can handle hard truths. I can't handle deception. Eliza found her voice.
This
though it
story
came
was
out smaller
posted on
than
the
she
channel
intended.
west of Betrayal.
What if I want to
Please
leave?
do not repost it
Then
in
you
any
leave.
form.
Silas looked at her directly, and she was surprised to see no anger in his pale eyes, just a kind of weary honesty. I'm not keeping a prisoner, but understand this. The nearest settlement is a 3-day walk through terrain that will kill you if you don't know what you're doing. Winter is coming, and it's brutal up here. If you try to leave before spring without proper preparation, you'll die. That's not a threat, it's just a fact. He stood up, moving to the packs to pull out bedrolls. You have tonight to think about it. Tomorrow, we reach the cabin. Once we're there, you decide, stay and work, or take your chances with the mountain. Either way, I won't stop you. He tossed her one of the bedrolls. Get some sleep. We start at first light. Eliza lay down near the fire, wrapped in the wool blanket and the bedroll that smelled like leather and pine. Above her, the stars were emerging in the darkening sky, more stars than she'd ever seen, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. She thought about the choice Silas had given her, stay or go, work or die. But as she lay there, listening to the wind moving through the peaks and the distant call of an eagle, she realized something. For the first time in her life, someone had given her a choice at all. She fell asleep to that thought, and to the sound of Silas Vane keeping watch against the darkness. The next day's climb was even more brutal than the first. The trail, if it could be called that, wound through narrow passes and across exposed ridges where the wind hit like a physical blow. Eliza's legs burned with the effort, and her lungs screamed for air that seemed to grow thinner with every step. But Silas had been right about one thing. She was stronger than her mother had given her credit for. Years of hauling water, chopping wood, and doing whatever backbreaking labor Margaret had assigned her had built muscle and endurance that Eliza had never appreciated until now. When the sun was directly overhead, they stopped at a small stream. Silas filled the canteens with ice-cold water that tasted like minerals and stone. Drink, he ordered. Altitude sickness hits hard if you're not careful. Eliza drank deeply, the cold water shocking her system but clearing her head. She watched as Silas knelt by the stream, splashing water on his face and neck. Without his hat, she could see more of the scar that marked his face, a brutal wound that must have nearly killed him. What happened? The question was out before she could stop it. Silas glanced at her, and for a moment she thought he'd refuse to answer. Then he shrugged. Bear, 5 years ago. I was tracking an elk and walked between a sow and her cubs. She objected. You survived a bear attack? Eliza couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. Obviously. There might have been a hint of dark humor in his tone. Though it was a near thing. I killed her, but not before she nearly took my face off. Spent 2 weeks in a fever, sure I was dying. When I didn't, I figured I must have a reason to keep breathing. He stood, shouldering his pack. Come on, we're close now. The final approach to Silas's cabin took another 3 hours of hard climbing. When they finally crested a ridge and Eliza saw their destination, she stopped in her tracks. The cabin sat in a small valley cupped between 3 peaks, protected from the worst of the wind but positioned to catch the southern sun. It was larger than she'd expected, a solid structure of thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a covered porch running along the front. Behind it, she could see a small barn, a smokehouse, and what looked like a root cellar built into the hillside. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a homestead. Welcome to Ridge's End, Silas said. It's not much, but it's mine. They descended into the valley as the afternoon light turned golden. Up close, Eliza could see the care that had gone into every aspect of the place. The logs were fitted precisely, the roof was tightly shingled, and the porch had been built with an eye toward both function and comfort, with a bench and a chair positioned to catch the morning sun. Silas opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. The interior was dim but surprisingly clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking area built into it. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with supplies and tools, and a single bed in the far corner. Furs and hides hung from the rafters, drying and curing, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke, leather, and herbs. You'll sleep there for now, Silas said, pointing to a second room she hadn't noticed. A small addition that held a narrow bed, a chest, and a window that looked out toward the peaks. I built that room 2 years ago thinking I might need a place to store equipment, but it'll serve as your quarters. Eliza set down her sack, her mind spinning. This wasn't what she'd expected. This wasn't some crude shelter where she'd be kept as a servant, or worse. This was a real home. Why? The question burst out of her. Why did you pay for me? What do you really want? Silas was lighting the fire, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. I watched your mother abuse you for 3 years. Every time I came down for supplies, there you were, thinner, quieter, more broken. Last spring, I saw her hit you in the street for dropping a sack of flour. You didn't fight back. You didn't even cry. You just took it, like you'd been taking it your whole life. He turned to face her, and something in his scarred face was almost gentle. I know what it's like to be treated as less than human. I know what it does to you, how it hollows you out until you forget you were ever worth anything. I swore a long time ago that if I ever had the means to help someone escape that kind of hell, I would. He crossed his arms. So that's why. I don't want anything from you except honest work and honest company. You're not my property. You're not my servant. You're someone who needed a way out, and I had $20 to spare. Eliza felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen solid for so long she'd forgotten it was there. It might have been hope. It might have been the beginning of trust. I'll work, she said, her voice stronger now. I'll learn whatever you need to teach me, and I won't steal or lie. Good. Silas turned back to the fire. Then we have an understanding. The first week at Ridge's End passed in a blur of exhaustion and discovery. Silas had been serious about the work. There was always something that needed doing, from hauling water from the spring to splitting wood for the constantly hungry fireplace. But he'd also been serious about teaching her. He showed her how to bank the fire properly so it would last through the night without burning through all their wood. He taught her which herbs growing wild on the mountainside could be used for cooking and which could treat infections or fever. He demonstrated the proper way to skin and clean a rabbit, his scarred hands moving with practiced efficiency as he explained each step. The meat goes in the smokehouse, he told her, hanging the cleaned rabbit on a hook. We'll smoke it tomorrow. Nothing goes to waste up here. The hide will be cured for gloves or patches. The bones will make soup stock. The organs will be bait for the trap lines. Eliza watched and learned, her hands awkward at first but growing more confident with each task. She'd thought she'd known hard work, but this was different. This work had purpose. This work was building something rather than simply surviving another day. In the evenings, after the day's labor was done and they'd eaten supper by the fire, Silas would settle into his chair with a cup of coffee while Eliza cleaned up. The first few nights passed in silence, but on the fourth evening she noticed him watching as she carefully wiped down the table. You can read, he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, surprised. My father taught me before he left. He said reading was the one thing no one could take away from you. Smart man. Silas gestured to a shelf in the corner. I've got some books. Not many, but enough. You're welcome to them if you want. Eliza crossed to the shelf, running her fingers over the spines. There were perhaps a dozen volumes, a Bible, a collection of Shakespeare's plays, a thick volume on medicinal plants, a book of American poetry, and several others whose titles had worn away. They were treasured possessions, carefully preserved in this harsh environment. Could I... She hesitated. Would you mind if I read aloud? In the evenings? Silas looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his pale eyes. I'd like that, he said finally. It's been a long time since I heard another voice up here. A long time since I heard words that weren't my own thoughts. So Eliza began reading to him. She started with the poetry because it was what she knew best, and because there was something about the rhythms and images that seemed to fit the mountain silence. She read Whitman and Dickinson, Longfellow, and Poe, her voice growing stronger with each evening as she found that Silas was actually listening, actually interested. Sometimes he would ask her to read a passage again, or to explain what she thought a particular poem meant. Those conversations, halting and uncertain at first, were the beginning of something neither of them had expected. They were becoming friends. The first snow came in mid-November.
This story
arriving
was
overnight with
posted on the
silent
channel
intensity.
west of Betrayal.
Eliza woke
Please
to find
do
the
not
world
repost it
transformed
in
into
any
a pristine
form.
landscape of white and shadow. The valley had become a bowl of untouched powder, and the peaks around them were sharp and brilliant against a sky of impossible blue. Beautiful, isn't it? Silas was already up, stoking the fire. It's also deadly. That snow is 3 feet deep in places, and more is coming. From now until April, we're sealed in. Hope you're not the type who needs to see other people. Eliza thought about Iron Ridge, about her mother's bitter face and the foreman's greedy eyes, about a lifetime of being treated as worthless. I'm not, she said. I really am not. Silas smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less haunted. Good, because the next few months are going to test that resolve. He was right. Winter at 10,000 feet was unlike anything Eliza had experienced. The cold was bone-deep and relentless, the kind that made you understand exactly how fragile human life was against the indifferent power of nature. The wind howled down from the peaks with a sound like screaming voices, and the snow piled higher and higher against the cabin walls until Silas had to dig a path to the barn twice a day just to feed the animals. But inside the cabin, there was warmth. There was work and routine and the growing comfort of companionship. Eliza learned to make bread that didn't taste like rocks. She learned to sew and mend with the precision necessary for survival. A poorly mended coat could mean frostbite, and frostbite could mean death. She learned to recognize the signs of an approaching storm in the behavior of the animals and the feel of the air. And slowly, in the quiet hours by the fire, she learned about Silas Vane. He'd been a cavalry scout during the Civil War, riding with Sherman through Georgia. He'd seen things that still woke him in the night sometimes. Eliza could hear him moving restlessly in the main room, stoking the fire in the small hours, wrestling with memories that wouldn't let him rest. After the war, he'd tried to go home to Pennsylvania, but home wasn't home anymore. Too many ghosts, too many people who couldn't understand what he'd become. So he'd gone west, working as a guide and hunter, until a woman named Sarah had convinced him to settle down. We had a place in Colorado, he told Eliza one evening, his voice distant. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. We were going to raise horses, maybe have children. We had plans. What happened? Eliza asked gently. Fever took her, Silas said flatly. Typhoid. It was brutal and fast, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do except watch her die. After that, I couldn't stay there. Every corner of that place was haunted by what we'd planned and what we'd lost. So I came up here, where the only ghosts are my own. Eliza felt her throat tighten with sympathy. I'm sorry. Life is sorry, Silas replied. All we can do is survive it and try to find some meaning in the surviving. As December turned to January, Eliza began to notice changes in herself. Her hands, once soft and clumsy, had grown strong and calloused. Her body, lean from years of inadequate food, was filling out with proper nutrition and hard work. Her mind, dulled by years of abuse, was sharpening again as Silas challenged her to think, to question, to understand the world around her. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger. And late at night, lying in her small room and listening to the wind howl outside, she would think about the girl who'd stood in the mud of Iron Ridge, waiting to be sold like livestock. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a story Eliza had heard once but couldn't quite remember living. But the past wasn't done with them yet. One morning in late January, Silas returned from checking the trap lines with his face grim and his rifle held ready. We've got company, he said. Someone's camped about 2 miles down the valley. I saw smoke. Eliza felt her blood run cold. Who would be out here in winter? Someone who doesn't want to be found, Silas replied. Or someone looking for something they shouldn't be looking for. Either way, it's trouble. He spent the rest of the day preparing, checking ammunition, sharpening knives, positioning supplies where they could be quickly grabbed if they needed to leave in a hurry. Eliza watched and helped, a cold knot of fear growing in her stomach. That night, neither of them slept much. Silas kept watch from the window, his rifle across his knees, while Eliza sat by the fire and pretended to read. The words on the page might as well have been in a foreign language for all the sense they made. Near midnight, Silas stiffened. "Put out the lamp," he said quietly. Eliza obeyed, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the glow of the banked fire. She could hear it now, the soft crunch of boots in snow getting closer. Silas moved to the door, positioning himself to one side with his rifle raised. "If I tell you to run," he whispered, "you go out the back window and head for the tree line. Follow the stream down. Don't stop. Don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," Eliza heard herself say. "You'll do what I tell you." His voice was hard. "I didn't bring you up here to die in whatever this is." Before she could respond, a voice called out from the darkness. "Silas Vane! I know you're in there. I'm coming in, and I'm unarmed." Silas's jaw tightened, but after a moment he lowered the rifle slightly. "Come ahead slow, hands where I can see them." The door swung open, and a man stumbled in, young, maybe 25, with wild eyes and frost in his beard. He was dressed for the mountains, but looked haggard, desperate. "Please," he gasped. "Please, you have to help me. They're coming, and if they find me, they'll kill me." Silas kept the rifle trained on him. "Who's coming, and why should I care?" The man's eyes darted between Silas and Eliza. "Sheriff Rourke and his deputies. They're saying I robbed the payroll wagon and killed 2 men, but I swear to you I didn't do it. It was Rourke himself. I saw him, but who's going to believe a drifter over a lawman?" The name hit Eliza like a physical blow. Sheriff Amos Rourke. She knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. And suddenly, the quiet safety of Ridge's End was shattered, and the real danger was just beginning. The stranger stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his face pale beneath the frost that clung to his beard. Silas hadn't lowered his rifle an inch, and Eliza could see the calculation in his pale eyes, deciding whether this desperate man was telling the truth or setting a trap. "Start talking," Silas said, his voice cold as the winter air streaming through the open door. "And make it quick. You're letting the heat out." The young man stumbled forward, and Silas kicked the door shut behind him without taking his eyes off their unexpected visitor. "My name's Thomas Whitley. I was working as a guard on the payroll wagon that runs from Iron Ridge to the mining camps up north. 3 weeks ago, we were ambushed on the pass road." He sank onto the bench by the door, his hands shaking, whether from cold or fear, Eliza couldn't tell. It was supposed to be a routine run, $5,000 in gold and silver, 2 armed guards, a driver. I was one of the guards, along with a man named Garrett Hayes. We'd done the run a dozen times, never had any trouble. "Get to the point," Silas growled. Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. "We were halfway through Devil's Canyon when shots rang out. The driver went down first, then Garrett. I took cover behind the wagon, returning fire, but there were too many of them. I caught a glimpse of the leader, tall man, broad shoulders, wearing a deputy's badge. It was Sheriff Rourke's right-hand man, a bastard named Cobb." Eliza felt her stomach turn. She'd seen Deputy Cobb in Iron Ridge, a cruel-eyed man who wore his badge like a weapon and his authority like a club. "They took the payroll and rode off," Thomas continued, his voice hollow with remembered horror. "I thought they'd killed me too. I'd been hit in the side, bleeding bad. But I managed to crawl into the rocks and hide. I heard Rourke himself ride up maybe an hour later. He looked at the bodies, at the empty wagon, and he laughed. Actually laughed. That doesn't prove he was behind it," Silas said, though his expression had grown darker. "No, but what he said next does." Thomas looked up, his young face haggard. "He told Cobb they'd done good work. Said the territorial governor would believe whatever story they fed him about a drifter robbing the wagon. Said they'd split the gold and no one would be the wiser because dead men don't testify." He pulled aside his coat, showing a crude bandage wrapped around his torso, dark with old blood. "I stayed hidden for 2 days, waiting for them to clear out. Then I started running, but Rourke put out word that I was the robber, that I'd killed those men. He's got every bounty hunter and lawman in 3 territories looking for me." Silas finally lowered his rifle, but his expression remained wary. "Why come here? Why drag your trouble to my door?" "Because I had nowhere else to go," Thomas said desperately. "I heard about you in Iron Ridge, the mountain man who lives above the snow line, who doesn't answer to anyone. I thought maybe, just maybe, You'd be willing to help someone the law says is guilty, but who's actually innocent. You thought wrong, Silas replied flatly. I don't get involved in other people's problems. I came up here to avoid exactly this kind of mess. Silas, Eliza said softly.
This story
It
was
the first
posted
time
on the
she'd
channel
spoken,
west of
and both men
Betrayal.
turned to look
Please
at her.
do not repost it
If
in
he's
any
telling
form.
the truth, if, Silas interrupted. That's a big word, Eliza. For all we know, he's exactly what Rourke says he is, a murderer and a thief spinning a story to save his own skin. Thomas started to protest, but Silas cut him off with a gesture. You'll stay the night. In the morning, you leave. That's all I'm offering. The young man's face fell, but he nodded. Thank you. That's more than I had any right to expect. Silas directed Thomas to sleep by the fire, keeping his rifle close, even as he retreated to his own bed. Eliza lay in her small room, listening to the stranger's labored breathing and the crackle of the fire, her mind racing. She believed him. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was naive, but something in Thomas Whitley's desperate eyes had rung true. And if he was telling the truth, then Sheriff Amos Rourke was not just corrupt. He was a murderer and a thief who wore a badge and twisted the law to his own purposes. Men like that didn't leave loose ends. Morning came cold and bright, the sun turning the snow-covered valley into a blinding field of white. Eliza rose early and found Silas already awake, sitting by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching the tree line. You didn't sleep, she observed. Couldn't. He glanced at her. Something about his story doesn't sit right. Not because I think he's lying, but because if he's telling the truth, Rourke will come looking for him. And when he does, anyone hiding him becomes a target. Thomas stirred by the fire, groaning as he sat up. The crude bandage around his torso had bled through during the night, fresh red staining the cloth. Let me see that, Eliza said, her tone brooking no argument. She'd learned enough about wound care over the winter to know infection when she saw it, and Thomas's injury was dangerously close to turning septic. The young man hesitated, then nodded, unwrapping the bandage with shaking hands. The bullet wound in his side was angry and inflamed, the edges showing the telltale signs of infection beginning to take hold. This needs to be cleaned properly, Eliza told Silas, and he needs antibiotics or he'll be dead in a week. I don't have antibiotics, Silas replied, just herbs and whiskey. Then that'll have to do. Eliza set water to boil, gathering the supplies she'd need, clean cloth, the jar of golden seal, an echinacea tincture Silas had shown her how to make, a bottle of strong whiskey, and a needle and thread for the stitches that should have been put in weeks ago. Thomas gritted his teeth as she worked, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made him hiss in pain, then applying the herbal mixture before carefully stitching the ragged edges closed. It wasn't pretty work, but it was competent, another skill she'd learned in this harsh place where doctors were 3 days' ride away, and winter made that ride impossible. You've got steady hands, Thomas managed when she was done. I've had good teachers, Eliza replied, glancing at Silas. The mountain man was still watching the tree line, his expression troubled. You need to leave today, he told Thomas. Head west over the ridge. There's a trapper's cabin about 10 miles that way. Abandoned, but it'll keep you alive if you can make it there. Stay put until spring, then get as far from this territory as you can. I can't run forever, Thomas protested. Rourke will keep looking. He has to. I'm the only witness who can prove what he did. Then you're a dead man, Silas said bluntly. Accept it and make what peace you can. Before Thomas could respond, a sound cut through the morning air, distant but distinct. Dogs baying. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his face gone hard. They're tracking you. How long have they been on your trail? I don't know, Thomas stammered. I was careful, I swear. Not careful enough. Silas grabbed his rifle and a bandolier of ammunition. Eliza, pack emergency supplies, food, blankets, ammunition. Enough for 3 days. Do it now. She moved without question, her heart hammering as she stuffed a pack with dried meat, hardtack, matches, and everything else they might need to survive in the wilderness. The baying of the dogs was getting closer, echoing off the valley walls. How many? Thomas asked, his face white. Silas was looking through a spyglass, scanning the approaches to the valley. 4 men on horseback, plus the dogs. Rourke himself is leading them. I can see that bastard's gray coat from here. He lowered the spyglass, his jaw tight. They're not going to leave witnesses. Thomas is right about that much. Rourke can't afford to let anyone who might know the truth survive. What do we do? Eliza asked. Silas looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his scarred face. We run. All of us. There's a cave system about 5 miles north, up in the high rocks. It's defensible, and there are enough passages that we can lose them if we're smart about it. You're helping me? Thomas looked stunned. Why? You said... I said a lot of things, Silas interrupted. But I'll be damned if I let Amos Rourke come to my home and threaten people under my protection. That includes you, whether I like it or not. They left within minutes, abandoning the warm cabin for the brutal cold of the high country. Silas led them on a route that avoided the obvious trails, moving through deep snow that left them gasping and exhausted. Behind them, the baying of the dogs grew steadily closer. They're gaining, Thomas panted, struggling with his injured side. Keep moving, Silas commanded. We just need to reach the rocks. The climb became a desperate race against time and terrain. The snow was chest-deep in places, and every step felt like moving through quicksand. Eliza's legs burned with the effort, her lungs screaming for air in the thin atmosphere, but she refused to fall behind. A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet striking a tree trunk 20 feet to their left. They've spotted us, Thomas shouted. Run! Silas returned fire, his rifle barking 3 times in rapid succession. Eliza didn't know if he hit anything, but the shots bought them precious seconds as Rourke's men took cover. They reached the rocks as the sun was starting to set, scrambling up a narrow cleft between massive boulders. The cave entrance was barely visible, hidden behind a screen of ice and frozen brush. Silas tore through it, ushering them inside, then turned and fired again at the pursuing men. Get back, he roared. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Sheriff Rourke's voice echoed back, smooth and authoritative. Silas Vane, we're pursuing a dangerous criminal. Stand aside and let us do our duty. Your duty? Silas laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. I know what you did, Rourke. Thomas Whitley told me everything, the payroll robbery, the murders, all of it. There was a long silence. Then Rourke spoke again, and all pretense of civility was gone from his voice. Then you've signed your own death warrant, Mountain Man. You and whoever else is hiding in there with you. Gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off the rocks around the cave entrance. Silas pulled back deeper into the darkness, where Eliza and Thomas waited. They're not leaving, Thomas said unnecessarily. No, Silas agreed. They can't. We know too much now. He looked at Eliza, his pale eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. I'm sorry. I should have sent you away this morning, should have kept you out of this. I wouldn't have gone, Eliza replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. This is my fight too now. And it was true. She'd spent her whole life being powerless, being acted upon rather than acting. But something had changed in her during these months in the mountains. She'd learned that she was strong, that she could endure, that she could fight. She wasn't going back to being the worthless girl in the mud. Not ever. The siege began in earnest as darkness fell. Rourke's men tried twice to rush the cave entrance, and both times Silas drove them back with precisely placed shots. But ammunition was finite, and they were trapped. There's a back passage, Silas told them as they huddled in the darkness. It leads deeper into the mountain. We could try to slip out that way, work our way around them. Or we could wait them out, Thomas suggested. They have to leave eventually. No, they don't, Eliza said quietly. They have supplies, horses, and time. We have what we could carry. If this becomes a waiting game, we lose. Silas nodded approvingly. She's right. We move tonight, use the darkness. If we can get past them, we can make it back to the cabin, gather more supplies, and then put some real distance between us and Rourke. They moved through the cave system like ghosts, Silas leading with a small lantern that he kept mostly shuttered, providing just enough light to avoid the worst hazards. The passages were narrow and treacherous, with sudden drops and tight squeezes that tested their nerve. They emerged from a hidden exit nearly half a mile from where they'd entered, coming out in a dense stand of pines. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the stars overhead like ice chips scattered across black velvet. This way, Silas whispered, leading them on a wide arc that would bring them back toward the cabin from an unexpected direction. They'd covered perhaps 2 miles when Thomas stumbled, his injured side finally betraying him. He went down hard, biting back a cry of pain. I can't, he gasped. I can't keep going. You two go ahead. Shut up, Silas said, not unkindly. He hauled the younger man to his feet. We're not leaving you. Eliza, take his other side. Together they half-carried Thomas through the snow, their
This story was
progress
posted on the
agonizingly
channel
slow.
west of Betrayal.
Dawn was breaking
Please
by the
do not
time they
repost
reached the
it
valley
in any
where the
form.
cabin sat. And what they saw made Eliza's heart sink. Smoke rose from where the cabin had been. Rourke's men had found it and burned it to the ground. Everything Silas had built, every careful preparation, every comfort they'd created, gone, reduced to smoking timbers and ash. No, Eliza breathed, feeling tears sting her eyes. Silas stood frozen, staring at the destruction. His face was a mask, but Eliza could see the muscles in his jaw working, could sense the rage and grief roiling beneath that carefully controlled exterior. The barn, he said finally. They might not have found the barn. They circled wide, approaching from the trees. The barn still stood, and miraculously, the animals inside were unharmed, Silas's horse and mule, along with the small herd of goats he kept for milk and meat. They were in a hurry, Silas observed, his voice hollow. Wanted to make their point and get back to hunting us. Inside the barn, they found some supplies that had been stored there, grain for the animals, a few tools, and most importantly, a cache of ammunition and another rifle Silas had kept hidden. It's not much, Thomas said, but it's something. Silas didn't respond. He was staring back at the ruins of his cabin, at the life he'd built being reduced to nothing by a corrupt lawman's greed and paranoia. We need a plan, Eliza said, trying to pull him back from whatever dark place his mind had gone. We can't just keep running. No, Silas agreed, his voice taking on a hard edge. We can't. He turned to face them, and Eliza saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Not just anger, but cold, calculated fury. Rourke thinks he can destroy everything I've built and walk away clean, Silas said. He's wrong. We're going to make him pay for what he's done. To Thomas, to those dead guards, to me. We're going to bring him down. How? Thomas asked. He has the law on his side, men who follow his orders, resources we can't match. But we have the truth, Eliza interjected, and we have something he doesn't expect, people who refuse to run anymore. Silas looked at her, and a ghost of a smile crossed his scarred face. When did you get so fierce? I learned from the best, she replied. They spent the rest of that day in the barn, planning and preparing. Silas knew the territory better than anyone, knew every trail and hiding place, every approach and escape route. If they were smart, if they were careful, they could turn the hunters into the hunted. Rourke will assume we'll try to reach another settlement, Silas explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt floor. He'll have men watching the passes, the main trails, so we don't go that way. We go deeper into the high country, to places where only someone who knows these mountains could survive. And then what? Thomas asked. Then we wait for our moment. Rourke can't maintain a large search party indefinitely. Eventually, he'll have to scale back, return to Iron Ridge to maintain appearances. When he does, when he's vulnerable, we strike. Strike how? Eliza wanted to know. Silas met her gaze. We take the fight to him. We find proof of what he did. The stolen gold, witnesses he might have threatened into silence. Anything we can use. And we make sure that proof reaches someone who can't be bought or intimidated. The territorial marshal, maybe. Or a federal judge. It was a desperate plan, built on long odds and assumptions that might prove fatal. But it was better than running blindly, better than waiting to be hunted down like animals. That night, as Thomas slept fitfully in the hay and the animals shifted in their stalls, Eliza found Silas standing outside the barn, staring at the ruins of his cabin in the moonlight. I'm sorry, she said softly. I know what that place meant to you. It was just a building, Silas replied, but his voice betrayed the lie. It was your home. It was the life you built after everything you lost. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I keep losing things. People, places, everything I try to hold on to. Sometimes I think I'm cursed. You're not cursed, Eliza told him fiercely. You're just alive and life is brutal. But you're still here, still fighting. That counts for something. Silas turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his scarred face seemed almost gentle. "You've changed, Eliza Crow. The girl I brought up here wouldn't have said that. She would have believed she deserved every bad thing that happened to her." "That girl is gone," Eliza said. "You taught me I was worth more than how others treated me. You taught me I could be strong. Now I'm going to prove it." Something passed between them in that moment, understanding, respect, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. Then Silas nodded and turned back toward the barn. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we start preparing for a war." The next weeks were unlike anything Eliza had imagined. Silas drove them hard, teaching them survival skills that went far beyond what she'd learned that first winter. He showed them how to move silently through the forest, how to read tracks and sign, how to set snares and traps that could catch more than animals. And he taught them to fight. "You've handled a rifle for hunting," he told Eliza, pressing his spare Winchester into her hands. "Now you need to learn to use it against men who'll be shooting back." He set up targets and drilled them relentlessly, loading, aiming, firing, reloading. Her shoulder bruised from the rifle's kick, her hands cramped from gripping the stock, but she persisted. Thomas, despite his injury, proved to be a natural shot, his hands steady even when his body was weak. "You're thinking too much," Silas told Eliza after she missed an easy shot. "You're afraid of what you're preparing to do. I understand that. Taking a life is no small thing, but if Rourke's men come for us, they won't hesitate. You need to be ready to defend yourself without mercy." She thought about that as she lined up another shot. Could she really kill someone? Could she pull the trigger knowing another human being would fall? Then she remembered the foreman in Iron Ridge, the way he'd looked at her like property. She remembered her mother's casual cruelty, a lifetime of being treated as worthless. She remembered watching Silas's cabin burn, knowing that Rourke would have killed them all without a second thought. The rifle cracked, and the target's center exploded into splinters. "Better," Silas said with approval. "Much better." They moved their camp every few days, never staying in one place long enough to be found. Silas taught them to cover their tracks, to move through water to break a trail, to use the terrain itself as concealment. They became shadows in the high country, watching and waiting while Rourke's search parties blundered through the wilderness below. And slowly, Eliza realized something. She was no longer afraid. The girl who'd stood in the mud of Iron Ridge, waiting passively for whatever fate the world handed her, had been replaced by someone harder, someone capable. She'd learned to trust her own strength, her own judgment, her own worth. She'd learned, finally, to fight. 3 weeks into their fugitive existence, the wolves came. It started with the animals acting strange. The horse whinnied nervously in the makeshift shelter they'd constructed, and the mule stamped and pulled against its tether. Silas noticed first, his hand going to his rifle even before the first howl split the night air. "Pack hunters," he said quietly, his scarred face grim in the firelight. "Big pack too, from the sound of it. They're probably starving. This winter's been harder than usual, and game is scarce." Eliza felt her pulse quicken. She'd heard wolves before, distant calls echoing across the valleys, but this was different. This was close and getting closer. "Will they attack?" Thomas asked, his hand moving to the pistol Silas had given him. "If they're desperate enough, they'll attack anything." Silas was already moving, banking the fire higher, positioning himself between the sounds and their small camp. "Eliza, get the animals inside the rocks, behind the fire line. Thomas, you're with me. We make noise, show them we're armed and dangerous." But even as they scrambled to defensive positions, Eliza could hear it. The movement through the trees, the soft patting of paws on snow, the low growls that spoke of hunger and predatory intent. The pack was surrounding them, cutting off escape routes with the practiced efficiency of hunters who'd done this 1,000 times before. The first wolf appeared at the edge of the firelight, its eyes reflecting yellow-green in the flames. It was massive, easily 120 pounds of muscle and teeth, its gray fur matted with ice and old blood. Behind it, more shapes moved in the darkness. She counted at least 7, maybe more. "Hold your fire until I say," Silas commanded, his voice steady despite the danger. "Ammunition is precious, and we don't want to waste shots in the dark." The lead wolf took a step closer, its lips pulling back to reveal fangs designed to tear through flesh and crush bone. It was testing them, gauging whether they were prey or threat. Silas raised his rifle and fired into the air, the crack of the gunshot echoing like thunder. The wolves scattered, but they didn't flee. They regrouped in the darkness, circling, waiting.
This story was
They're
posted
not
on the
leaving,
channel
Eliza
west
said,
of Betrayal.
her knuckles white
Please
around
do
her
not
own rifle.
repost it in any
No,
form.
Silas agreed. They're too hungry. They'll wait until we're weak, distracted, or asleep. Then they'll attack. The siege lasted through the night. Every hour, the wolves would probe their defenses, a darting run from one direction, a feint from another. Silas and Thomas took turns firing warning shots, driving them back each time, but the pack's persistence was terrifying. They weren't giving up. Dawn was breaking, the sky turning from black to gray, when the blizzard hit. It came without warning, a wall of wind and snow that turned the world into a whiteout. Visibility dropped to nothing, the temperature plummeted, and suddenly the wolves were the least of their problems. "Into the shelter!" Silas shouted over the roar of the wind. "Get the animals secured!" They scrambled to obey, but the storm was moving too fast. The horse panicked, rearing and breaking its tether, bolting into the blizzard. Silas lunged after it, disappearing into the white chaos. "Silas!" Eliza screamed, but the wind tore his name away. She could barely see Thomas 3 feet in front of her, could barely breathe through the snow that drove into her face like frozen needles. And then she heard it. Silas's shout of pain cut short, the sound of snarling, of a struggle. The wolves had found him in the storm. For a heartbeat, Eliza froze. Every instinct screamed at her to stay safe, to hide in the shelter and wait for the danger to pass. That's what the old Eliza would have done, the girl who'd stood in the mud and let the world happen to her. But that girl was dead. Eliza grabbed her rifle and ran into the blizzard, toward the sounds of violence. The world was a white void, disorienting and deadly. But she followed Silas's voice, his curses and shouts, until she nearly stumbled over the scene. 3 wolves had brought him down. The lead wolf had its jaws locked on his left arm, while the other 2 circled, looking for an opening. Silas was on his back in the snow, his rifle lost somewhere in the chaos, fighting with his knife against impossible odds. Eliza didn't think. She raised her Winchester and fired, the bullet catching the lead wolf in the shoulder. It yelped and released Silas's arm, spinning toward this new threat. She worked the lever action, chambered another round, and fired again. The second shot took the wolf in the chest, and it went down thrashing. The other 2 wolves turned on her, and she understood in that moment what real terror was. Not the passive fear of abuse or abandonment, but the active, immediate knowledge that death was seconds away and coming fast. She fired at the nearest wolf, missed, levered another round. The wolf was airborne, leaping for her throat, when Thomas's pistol cracked from somewhere to her left. The wolf twisted in midair and fell short, blood staining the snow. The last wolf decided 3 armed humans weren't worth the effort. It fled into the storm, and suddenly it was over. Eliza dropped to her knees beside Silas. His left arm was a mess of torn fabric and blood, the wolf's fangs having punched through his coat and into the muscle beneath. His face was gray with pain and blood loss. "You stupid, brave fool," he muttered, his voice weak. "You should have stayed in the shelter." "Shut up," Eliza told him, her hands already working to tear strips from her shirt for bandages. "You can lecture me about survival when you're not bleeding to death." Thomas appeared out of the blizzard, helping them drag Silas back to the shelter. The storm raged around them with biblical fury, but inside their small space between the rocks, with the fire built up and blankets wrapped around them, they created a pocket of warmth and safety. Eliza cleaned Silas's wounds with whiskey, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The bite was bad, deep punctures that had torn through muscle, maybe nicked the bone. Without proper medical care, infection was almost certain. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. "Everything hurts," Silas replied, but there was something like pride in his pale eyes as he looked at her. "You saved my life out there." "You saved mine first," Eliza said, threading a needle with surgical thread they'd salvaged from the cabin ruins. Seemed only fair to return the favor. She stitched his wounds closed while Thomas held him down, and Silas bit through a strip of leather to keep from screaming. When it was done, she wrapped the arm in clean bandages and mixed a strong dose of willow bark tea for the pain and fever that would inevitably follow. The blizzard lasted 3 days. They huddled in their shelter, burning through their precious firewood supply, rationing food that was already running low. Silas drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting the infection that turned his skin hot and clammy. On the second night, when his fever peaked and he thrashed in delirium, Eliza sat beside him and held his good hand, talking to him in a low voice about anything and everything. Memories of reading by the cabin fire, plans for rebuilding when this was over, stories from books she'd loved. "Don't you dare die," she told him fiercely. "Not after everything we've survived. You don't get to leave me now." Thomas watched them from across the small space, something knowing in his expression. "You love him," he said quietly. Eliza looked up, startled. It's all right," Thomas interrupted. "I've watched you two together, the way you move around each other, the way you communicate without words. You're a team, a partnership. Maybe more than that, maybe not yet, but it's there." She didn't deny it. Somewhere in the long winter nights and shared hardships, somewhere between learning to survive and learning to fight, her feelings for Silas Vane had shifted from gratitude to something deeper, something that made her chest ache when she looked at his scarred face and saw the man beneath the wounds. "He doesn't know," she said finally. "He knows," Thomas replied. "He's just scared. Men who've lost everything are always scared of having something to lose again." On the third day, the storm broke. The world emerged from the white chaos transformed, buried under 6 feet of fresh snow, the familiar landscape made strange and beautiful by the blizzard's passage. The sky was clear and impossibly blue, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. Silas woke lucid for the first time since the wolf attack, his fever broken but his body weak. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse. 3 days, Eliza told him, helping him sit up. "The storm's over, but you're not going anywhere for a while. That arm needs time to heal." "We don't have time." Silas tried to stand, swayed, and would have fallen if Thomas hadn't caught him. "Rourke will have waited out the storm too. As soon as the pass is clear, he'll be looking for us again." "Let him look," Eliza said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "We're not running anymore. We're going to finish this." Silas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, then we need to change tactics. We've been playing defense, staying hidden. It's time to go on offense." Over the next week, as Silas's arm slowly healed, they planned their strike. Thomas had remembered something during the storm, a conversation he'd overheard between Rourke and Deputy Cobb about where they'd hidden the stolen payroll gold. "There's an abandoned mine shaft about 8 miles from Iron Ridge," Thomas explained, sketching a rough map. "It was played out years ago, boarded up and forgotten. Rourke said they'd stashed the gold there temporarily, planned to move it once the heat died down. If we can retrieve that gold," Silas said, his tactical mind working through the possibilities, "we have physical proof of the crime. No story Rourke spins can explain away $5,000 in stolen payroll sitting in his hiding place." "But how do we get it without being caught?" Eliza wanted to know. "Rourke will have the mine watched." "Maybe," Silas conceded. "Or maybe he's arrogant enough to think no one knows about it. Either way, we need to scout it first, see what we're dealing with." They moved camp closer to the mine over the next few days, traveling at night and sleeping during the day when they were less likely to be spotted. Silas taught them to move like shadows, to read the landscape for threats, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. The abandoned mine sat in a narrow canyon, its entrance half collapsed and overgrown with dead brush. From their vantage point on the ridge above, they watched it for a full day and night, looking for signs of guards or activity. "Nothing," Thomas said, lowering the spyglass. "Either Rourke's too confident or too busy hunting us to spare men for guard duty. Or it's a trap," Silas countered. "Wait here. I'll go down and take a closer look." "Not with that arm you won't," Eliza said firmly. "I'll go."
But
"Absolutely not." "You can barely lift that arm above your shoulder," she interrupted. "And Thomas is still recovering from his own wound. I'm the only one at full strength, which makes me the logical choice." Silas started to argue, then stopped, recognizing the futility. The girl he'd brought up the mountain would never have spoken to him like this, would never have volunteered for danger. But Eliza wasn't that girl anymore. "Fine," he said grudgingly. "But you take the pistol, stay alert, and at the first sign of trouble, you run. Understood? Understood. Eliza made her way down to the mine as the sun was setting, using the lengthening shadows for cover. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands were steady. She'd learned to control fear, to use it rather than let it control her. The mine entrance was indeed unguarded.
This
She
story was
slipped
posted
inside,
on the
moving
channel
carefully
west
over the
of
debris
Betrayal.
and rotten timber.
Please do not
The shaft
repost
descended
it in any
steeply
form.
into darkness, but about 30 feet in, she found what they were looking for, a cache of canvas bags stacked against the wall, covered with a tarp. She opened one bag and her breath caught. Gold coins gleamed in the dim light filtering from the entrance. This was it. The stolen payroll, exactly where Thomas had said it would be. She was reaching for a second bag to verify its contents when she heard voices outside. Men's voices, getting closer. Eliza froze, her hand going to the pistol at her belt. She was trapped. The mine had only one entrance, and whoever was coming would see her the moment they stepped inside. "Told you we should have moved it weeks ago," one voice was saying. It sounded like Deputy Cobb. "What if that Whitley kid told someone before we caught up with him?" "Whitley's dead by now," another voice replied, Sheriff Rourke himself. "Frozen in some snowbank or torn apart by wolves. And even if by some miracle he survived, who's going to believe the word of a wanted criminal?" They were at the entrance now, blocking the light. Eliza pressed herself against the wall, hidden in shadow, barely breathing. "Still," Cobb persisted, "we should move the gold tonight, get it somewhere more secure." "Fine," Rourke said irritably. "We'll take it to the ranch, hide it in the—" He stopped mid-sentence, his hand going to his gun. "Do you smell that?" "Smell what?" "Perfume. Or soap. Something that doesn't belong in an abandoned mine shaft." Eliza's blood turned to ice. She'd washed that morning with the last of the soap from their supplies, not thinking about how the scent might linger in the still air of the mine. "Come out," Rourke commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I know someone's in here." She had seconds to make a choice. Come out peacefully and hope for mercy from a man who'd already proven he had none, or fight her way out against impossible odds. Eliza chose to fight. She stepped into the dim light with the pistol raised, and in the shocked instant before Rourke and Cobb could react, she fired twice. The first shot went wide, but the second caught Cobb in the shoulder. He went down cursing, and Rourke dove for cover. Eliza ran deeper into the mine, into the absolute darkness beyond the entrance, gambling that she knew something they didn't. Silas had taught her that abandoned mines often had secondary shafts, air vents, or old exploratory tunnels that might provide an escape route. Behind her, Rourke's gun roared, bullets ricocheting off stone. She ran blind, one hand on the wall to guide her, praying she wouldn't fall into some unseen pit. Her foot caught on a timber and she stumbled, went down hard, the pistol skittering away into darkness. Rourke's footsteps were getting closer. She could see the glow of his lantern, hear his heavy breathing. He was methodical, checking every shadow, every corner. "Nowhere to run, girl," he called out. "Come out now and I'll make it quick. Make me hunt you and I'll take my time." Eliza's hand closed on a rock the size of her fist. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. She waited, controlling her breathing, until Rourke was close enough that she could see his face in the lantern light. Then she threw the rock with all her strength. It hit the lantern, shattering the glass and plunging them both into absolute darkness. Rourke cursed and fired blindly, but Eliza was already moving, scrambling past him toward the entrance. She burst out of the mine into twilight and found herself face to face with two more of Rourke's deputies, their guns already drawn. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Eliza saw their fingers tightening on the triggers, saw her own death reflected in their cold eyes, and knew she'd gambled and lost. Then rifle fire cracked from the ridge above, and both deputies went down. Silas and Thomas appeared from the rocks, moving fast, weapons ready. "Run!" Silas shouted. They ran, scrambling up the rocky slope, while Rourke's enraged shouts echoed from the mine below. More shots followed them, but the failing light and the difficult terrain worked in their favor. By the time they reached the horses they'd hidden on the far side of the ridge, full darkness had fallen. "That was incredibly stupid," Silas told Eliza as they rode hard for the high country. "And incredibly brave. Don't ever do it again." "I found the gold," she said breathlessly. "It's there, exactly where Thomas said." Good, Silas replied. But now Rourke knows we know about it. He'll move it tonight, and we'll have lost our proof. Not necessarily, Thomas interjected. Cobb was hit. He'll need medical attention, which means they have to go back to Iron Ridge. That gives us a window. If we're fast enough, we can get back to the mine, retrieve the gold, and be gone before they return. It was risky, maybe suicidal, but it was also their best chance. They circled back under cover of darkness, approaching the mine from a different angle. As Thomas had predicted, Rourke and his wounded deputy had left, presumably heading back to town for supplies and reinforcements. Working quickly, they hauled the bags of gold from the mine and loaded them onto their pack animals. It was back-breaking work, and every moment they expected to hear riders coming, but luck was with them. By midnight, they were heading back into the high country with the evidence they needed to prove Rourke's guilt. Now what? Thomas asked as they made camp in a sheltered valley. We have the gold, but how do we use it? We can't exactly walk into Iron Ridge and accuse the sheriff of being a thief. No, Silas agreed, wincing as he tried to lift a bag with his injured arm. But we can get word to someone who has the authority to investigate. The territorial marshal makes circuit through these parts every few months. If we can find him, convince him to look into Rourke's activities. If, Eliza repeated. That's a lot to hang our lives on. You have a better idea? Silas challenged. She thought about it, an idea forming. What if we don't go to the law? What if we go to the people? Both men looked at her. Explain, Silas said. Rourke's power comes from his badge and the fear he inspires, Eliza said, working through it as she spoke. But he's also a politician. He was elected sheriff, which means he answers to the voters. What if we expose him publicly? Make it impossible for him to hide behind his authority. How? Thomas asked. The spring gathering, Eliza said, remembering the annual event where miners, ranchers, and townsfolk from all over the territory came together to trade, socialize, and conduct business. It's in 2 weeks. Everyone will be there, hundreds of people, including merchants and newspapermen from as far as Denver. If we present our evidence there, in front of witnesses, Rourke can't intimidate or buy off. Silas was nodding slowly. It could work. Public exposure, multiple witnesses, including members of the press. Rourke couldn't kill everyone, and he couldn't spin a story that would satisfy that many people seeing the evidence firsthand. It's bold, Thomas said. Maybe too bold. Bold is all we have left, Eliza replied. We can't run forever, and we can't win a straight fight against Rourke and his men, but we can win in the court of public opinion. Silas looked at her with something like wonder. You've come a long way from the girl in the mud. I had a good teacher, she said. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for what would be their final confrontation. Silas's arm was healing slowly but well, the infection kept at bay by Eliza's careful nursing. Thomas was regaining his strength, the bullet wound in his side finally starting to close properly. And Eliza continued her training, becoming more proficient with weapons, more confident in her own abilities. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to move with purpose rather than fear, to stand and fight rather than hide and hope. She'd learned, finally, what she was worth. The night before they were to descend to the spring gathering, Silas found her sitting outside their camp, looking at the stars. He'd brought 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one as he settled beside her. Tomorrow's going to be dangerous, he said quietly. Rourke won't let us expose him without a fight. I know, Eliza replied. You could still leave. Take your share of the gold, head to California or Oregon, start a new life where Rourke's shadow won't reach you. She turned to look at him, this scarred, dangerous man who'd saved her from a fate worse than death and taught her to save herself. Is that what you want? For me to leave? No, Silas admitted, and the raw honesty in his voice made her heart ache. I want you to stay. I want you safe. I want... He stopped, struggling with words that didn't come easily. I want things I have no right to want. Eliza set down her coffee and took his hand, the scarred, strong hand that had shown her how to survive, how to fight, how to live. Then want them anyway, she said. Tomorrow we might die. But tonight, we're alive. That has to count for something. Silas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw everything he couldn't say written in his pale eyes, fear and hope, grief and healing, The weight of all he'd lost and the fragile possibility of something new. Then he kissed her, and the world narrowed to that single point of connection, that moment of two wounded souls finding solace in each other. It was gentle and fierce, tender and desperate, everything they'd survived pouring into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers. After
This
tomorrow,
story was posted
said,
on the channel
if
west
we
of the
survive this,
trail. Please
build
do not
something new.
repost it in any
something
form.
that can't be burned down or taken away. Promise? Eliza whispered. Promise. They sat together until dawn, watching the stars fade and the sky lighten, gathering strength for the battle ahead. Tomorrow they would face Rourke and his corruption, would risk everything on a desperate gamble that truth could triumph over power. But tonight, they had this, each other, and the knowledge that they were worth fighting for. That would have to be enough. The spring gathering at Iron Ridge was already in full swing when they arrived. The settlement transformed from its usual muddy desperation into something almost festive. Merchants had set up stalls along the main street, their wares displayed on tables draped with bright cloth. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air, and somewhere a fiddle was playing. People had come from mining camps and ranches scattered across 3 territories, hungry for commerce, news, and the simple pleasure of human company after a long winter. Eliza sat on the wagon seat beside Silas, her hands clenched tight in her lap to hide their trembling. They'd left the horses and most of their supplies hidden in a canyon 2 miles out, bringing only what they needed for this confrontation: the stolen gold, Thomas's testimony, and the weapons they hoped they wouldn't have to use. There, Thomas said from the back of the wagon, his voice tight. That's Rourke. Sheriff Amos Rourke stood on the steps of the territorial office, holding court with a group of merchants and miners. He cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his gray coat immaculate, his silver badge catching the morning sunlight. Everything about him projected authority and respectability. Looking at him, you'd never guess he was a murderer and a thief. He doesn't know we're here yet, Silas observed, guiding their wagon toward the central square. We need to get set up before he spots us. Once we start this, there's no going back. They'd planned carefully for this moment. The territorial surveyor had arranged for a speaker's platform in the town square, a raised stage where merchants could advertise their wares and community leaders could make announcements. It was the perfect venue for what they had in mind: public, visible, and surrounded by witnesses. Eliza helped unload the bags of gold while Thomas began spreading word through the crowd that there would be an important announcement at noon, something concerning Sheriff Rourke and the payroll robbery that had been the talk of the territory all winter. People were curious by nature, and the promise of scandal drew them like moths to flame. By the time the church bell chimed 12 times, nearly 200 people had gathered in the square. Merchants and miners, ranchers and drifters, even a thin man with spectacles and a notebook who introduced himself as a correspondent for the Denver Post. Exactly the audience they needed. Silas stepped onto the platform first, and the crowd's murmur died to curious silence. Many knew him by reputation, the scarred mountain man who lived above the snow line and spoke to no one. His presence here, in the middle of town, making a public appearance, was strange enough to command attention. "My name is Silas Vane," he began, his voice carrying across the square. 6 months ago, I took in a young woman named Eliza Crow, gave her shelter and safety when she had nothing. 3 months ago, a man named Thomas Whitley came to my door, hunted and desperate, accused of crimes he didn't commit. The crowd shifted, people exchanging glances. This wasn't the sales pitch they'd expected. Thomas Whitley was framed, Silas continued, framed by the same man who actually robbed the payroll wagon and murdered 2 innocent guards. That man is your sheriff, Amos Rourke. The murmur that ran through the crowd was like thunder. People turned to look at Rourke, who'd gone very still on the territorial office steps, his hand resting on his gun belt. "That's slander!" Rourke called out, his voice projecting authority and outrage. "This man is clearly deranged, and he's harboring a known criminal. I'll thank you all to put Thomas Whitley. Come forward," Silas interrupted. Thomas stepped onto the platform and the crowd gasped. The wanted posters had been up all winter. Everyone knew his face. But instead of the dangerous criminal they expected, they saw a young man with honest eyes and healing wounds, someone who looked more like a victim than a villain. "Tell them what you saw," Silas said. Thomas's voice shook at first, but it grew stronger as he spoke. He described the ambush in detail, the shots that killed the driver and Garrett Hayes, the men wearing deputy badges, and most damningly, Sheriff Rourke himself arriving to congratulate his men on a job well done. "He's lying," Rourke shouted, pushing forward through the crowd. "This is a desperate attempt to avoid justice. I have witnesses who place Whitley at the scene." "Witnesses you threatened or bribed," Silas countered. "But we're not relying on testimony alone. Eliza, show them." Eliza stepped forward, and for a moment she was back in the mud of this very street, being offered up like cargo by her bitter mother. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She'd climbed mountains and survived winters and faced down wolves in the darkness. She'd learned her own worth, and no one, not Rourke, not fear, not the weight of the past, could take that from her. She opened the first bag and tilted it, letting gold coins spill across the platform in a glittering cascade. The crowd surged forward, voices rising in shock and excitement. "This is the stolen payroll," Eliza announced, her voice clear and strong. $5,000 in gold and silver, hidden by Sheriff Rourke in an abandoned mine 8 miles from here. We retrieved it 5 days ago, and we're returning it to its rightful owners, the territorial government and the miners who worked for it. "She's a thief," Rourke snarled, drawing his gun. "She stole that gold from where, Sheriff?" the Denver Post correspondent called out, his pencil moving rapidly across his notebook. "If this is stolen property, where exactly did Miss Crow steal it from? And why would she return it if she'd gone to the trouble of taking it?" Rourke's face had gone red with fury. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. "Deputy Cobb," he barked, "arrest these criminals!" But Cobb wasn't moving. The deputy stood at the edge of the crowd, his shoulder still bandaged from Eliza's bullet. And something in his face had changed. He'd signed up to be a lawman, not a murderer's accomplice, and the weight of what they'd done was written in his eyes. "I can't, Sheriff," Cobb said quietly. "Not if what they're saying is true." "It's not true, you fool," Rourke spat. "These are lies spread by criminals trying to save their own skins." "Then where's the real payroll?" someone in the crowd shouted. "If this gold isn't the stolen money, where is it?" Rourke's hand tightened on his gun. Eliza could see him calculating, weighing his options. He could try to brazen it out, deny everything, and hope his authority carried the day. Or he could silence the witnesses before they could do more damage. He chose violence. Rourke's gun came up fast, aimed directly at Thomas's chest. But Silas was faster. He'd been waiting for this moment, reading Rourke's body language, anticipating the sheriff's choice. His hand was already on his own weapon when Rourke drew. The 2 shots came almost simultaneously, but Silas's aim was truer. Rourke's bullet went wide, splintering wood near Thomas's head. Silas's bullet caught the sheriff in the gun hand, sending his weapon spinning away into the crowd. Chaos erupted, people scattered, screaming, diving for cover. 2 more of Rourke's deputies drew their guns, and suddenly the peaceful gathering had become a battlefield. "Get down!" Silas shouted, pushing Eliza behind the platform's makeshift barricade. Bullets tore through the air where she'd been standing. Thomas returned fire with his pistol, driving 1 deputy back. But they were badly outnumbered, and Rourke's men had the advantage of cover in the surrounding buildings. "We can't hold this position," Silas said grimly, reloading his rifle with practiced speed despite his injured arm. "There are too many of them." "Then we make them stop shooting," Eliza said, an idea forming. She stood up, ignoring Silas's curse of alarm, and shouted to the crowd. "Everyone, listen. Every shot Rourke's men fire is proof of his guilt. An innocent lawman would be trying to calm the situation, not murder witnesses in front of 200 people and a newspaper reporter. It was a desperate gamble, but it worked. People stopped running and started thinking. They began to realize that Rourke's response to the accusations was speaking louder than any denial. An innocent man would demand a fair trial, would welcome an investigation. A guilty man would try to silence his accusers. "She's right," the Denver Post correspondent called out, his voice carrying authority. "Sheriff Rourke, I'm going to publish every detail of what happened here today. If you're innocent, you should want that investigation. If you're not, well, the whole territory is watching now." Rourke, clutching his bleeding hand, looked around at the crowd. He saw doubt in faces that had always shown him respect. He saw his deputies hesitating, unwilling to murder civilians in broad daylight. He saw his carefully constructed authority crumbling around him, and he made one final desperate play. "Margaret Crow!" he shouted. "Where's Margaret Crow?" Eliza's blood turned to ice. Through the crowd, she saw her mother being pushed forward by one of Rourke's remaining loyal deputies. Margaret looked older than Eliza
This story
remembered,
was posted on the
worn
channel
down by
west of
whiskey and
Betrayal.
bitterness,
Please
but
do
her
not
eyes still
repost
held
it
that
in any
familiar
form.
contempt. "That's my daughter on that platform," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the square. "She's a liar and a thief, always has been. Everything she's saying is a desperate attempt to avoid facing justice for crimes she committed." "What crimes?" someone in the crowd demanded. Margaret didn't hesitate. "She stole from me, assaulted me, ran off into the mountains with that madman Vane. She's been nothing but trouble since the day she was born. You can't trust a word she says." It was a familiar song, one Eliza had heard her entire life. But this time, instead of the old shame and self-doubt rising up, she felt only a cold, clear anger. "You sold me," Eliza said, her voice cutting through the noise. "You stood in this very street and sold me like livestock for $20 because you said I ate more than I was worth. And before that, you spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, beating me, using me for whatever suited your needs." She stepped to the edge of the platform, looking directly at her mother. "But I'm not that girl anymore. I survived everything you did to me and everything this mountain tried to throw at me. I learned I was strong. I learned I was worth something, and now I'm going to make sure a corrupt sheriff doesn't get away with murder just because he has a badge." Margaret's face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. "You ungrateful—" "I'm done with you," Eliza interrupted. "You don't get to define me anymore. You don't get to make me small. I'm standing here in front of all these witnesses telling the truth, and nothing you say can change that." The crowd had gone silent, hanging on every word. This wasn't just about a payroll robbery anymore. This was about justice, about truth, about a young woman refusing to be broken by the world that had tried to destroy her. Rourke saw his last weapon failing. He lunged forward, reaching for Margaret, clearly intending to use her as a hostage. But Deputy Cobb had finally chosen his side. He stepped between Rourke and Margaret, his own gun drawn. "It's over, Sheriff," Cobb said quietly. "I'll testify to everything. The robbery, the murders, the cover-up. All of it." "You traitor," Rourke hissed. "I made you. I gave you everything." "You made me a criminal," Cobb replied, "and I'm done with it." Rourke looked around wildly, seeking escape, but there was none. The crowd had surrounded him, and even his most loyal deputies were backing away, unwilling to go down with him. He was caught, exposed, finished. But cornered animals were the most dangerous, and Rourke had one card left to play. His left hand, his uninjured hand, went to a hideout gun at his ankle, a small Derringer that nobody had thought to check for. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking that lying girl with me." He brought the Derringer up fast, aimed at Eliza's heart. Time seemed to slow. Eliza saw the gun, saw Rourke's finger tightening on the trigger, saw her death rushing toward her with terrible inevitability. Then Silas was there, putting himself between her and the gun, his body a shield. The Derringer cracked, small but deadly, and Silas stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. "No!" Eliza screamed, catching him as he fell. The crowd erupted in fury. Whatever sympathy Rourke might have claimed evaporated in that moment. He just shot an unarmed man in front of 200 witnesses, and the crowd's mood turned from shock to rage in an instant. Rourke tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Miners and merchants, people who'd been afraid of him for years, grabbed him and dragged
This
him down.
story was posted
His
on the
Derringer
channel
was torn
west
from
of
his
Betrayal.
hand, his badge
Please do not
ripped from his
repost
coat.
it in any form.
They bound his hands and hauled him toward the territorial office's jail cell, their voices a roar of righteous anger. But Eliza heard none of it. She was on her knees beside Silas, her hands pressed against the wound in his chest, feeling his blood pulse hot and wet through her fingers. "Stay with me," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Silas, don't leave me. Not now, not after everything." His pale eyes found hers, and despite the pain, he managed a small smile. "Told you," he whispered. "Told you that you were fierce." "Don't talk," Eliza said desperately. "Save your strength. We'll get you to a doctor." "Already here," a voice said. An older man pushed through the crowd, carrying a black medical bag. I'm Dr. Harrison from Denver. Let me see. He knelt beside Silas, examining the wound with practiced efficiency. His face was grave, but not hopeless. The bullet's still in there, and he's losing blood fast. I need to operate immediately. Can you get him to my surgery? We'll carry him, Thomas said, appearing at Eliza's side. Together with several miners who'd been watching, they lifted Silas as gently as possible and carried him toward the doctor's office. The next hours passed in a blur of blood and fear. Eliza waited outside the surgery, her hands still stained with Silas's blood, while Dr. Harrison worked to save his life. Thomas sat with her, offering quiet support, while the chaos in the town continued around them. Deputy Cobb came by to give them an update. "Rourke's locked up," he reported, "and he's talking, trying to cut a deal. He's admitted to the robbery and named the men who helped him. We've already arrested 3 of them." "What about the murdered guards?" Eliza asked, her voice hollow. "He claims that was an accident, that things got out of hand," Cobb said. "But it doesn't matter. He'll hang for murder either way. The territorial marshal is being sent for, and that newspaper correspondent has already filed his story. By the time this is over, everyone from here to Washington will know what Rourke did." It should have felt like victory, but all Eliza could think about was Silas lying on an operating table, fighting for his life because he'd stepped between her and a bullet. The sun was setting when Dr. Harrison finally emerged, wiping blood from his hands. Eliza shot to her feet, her heart in her throat. "He's alive," the doctor said, and Eliza's knees nearly buckled with relief. "The bullet was lodged near his lung, but I got it out. He's lost a lot of blood, and the next few days will be critical, but he's strong. He's got a good chance. Can I see him?" "For a moment, he's heavily sedated, but he's been asking for you." Eliza entered the recovery room to find Silas lying on a narrow bed, his chest wrapped in bandages, his face pale but peaceful. She took his hand, and his eyes fluttered open. "Did we win?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We won," Eliza confirmed, tears running down her face again. "Rourke's arrested, the truth is out, and you're going to be fine." "Good," Silas managed, "because I have promises to keep, about building something new." "We will," Eliza said, squeezing his hand gently. "As soon as you're well, we'll go back to the mountain and rebuild. Everything we lost, everything we dreamed of. We'll make it real." "Together?" he asked. "Together," she promised. He smiled and closed his eyes, drifting back into healing sleep. Eliza stayed beside him as the room darkened, holding his hand, keeping watch the way he'd kept watch over her through that long winter. 3 days later, Silas was strong enough to sit up and take solid food. The territorial marshal had arrived and taken formal custody of Rourke and his accomplices. The stolen payroll had been officially returned, and Thomas Whitley's name had been cleared with full pardons issued for any alleged crimes. Margaret Crowe had left town the day after the confrontation, disappearing without a word to her daughter. Eliza felt nothing about her departure. No sadness, no anger, just a quiet relief that another chapter had finally closed. The Denver Post ran a front-page story about the corrupt sheriff and the brave mountain man who'd exposed him, but they got some details wrong. In their version, Silas was the hero who'd rescued the damsel and brought the villain to justice. Eliza didn't correct them. She knew the truth, that she'd saved herself, that she'd found her own strength, that the girl who'd stood in the mud had transformed into a woman who could face down corruption and violence without flinching. A week after the shooting, Dr. Harrison declared Silas well enough to travel. They loaded their wagon with supplies donated by grateful townspeople, lumber for rebuilding, food for the journey, even some new books that a merchant insisted Eliza accept. "You're heroes," the merchant said. "You stood up when no one else would. This territory owes you a debt." "We just did what was right," Eliza replied. "That's what makes you heroes," the merchant said with a smile. They left Iron Ridge on a bright spring morning, the wagon loaded with everything they needed to start fresh. Thomas rode with them, having accepted Silas's offer to help rebuild the cabin and stay on as a partner in whatever life they built in the high country. As they climbed toward the mountains, Eliza looked back at the settlement one last time. She'd arrived there broken and beaten, treated as worthless by the only family she'd ever known. She was leaving as someone entirely different, strong, capable, and free. "No regrets?" Silas asked, following her gaze. "None," Eliza said firmly. That girl they threw away doesn't exist anymore. I'm someone new now, someone better. You were always
This
better,
story was
Silas
posted
told
on the
her.
channel west
You just
of
needed the
Betrayal.
chance to prove
Please
it.
do not repost it
The
in
journey
any
back
form.
to Ridge's End took 3 days. When they finally crested the ridge and looked down into the valley, Eliza's breath caught. The burned ruins of the cabin still stood, a stark reminder of what they'd lost. But spring had transformed the rest. Wildflowers carpeted the meadow, the stream ran high with snowmelt, and the peaks around them gleamed white against an impossibly blue sky. It's beautiful, Thomas said, seeing it for the first time in daylight and peace, rather than darkness and fear. It will be again, Silas said. We'll rebuild, and this time it'll be even better. A real home, not just a shelter. They worked through that spring and summer, 3 people building something from nothing. The new cabin rose larger than the old one, with proper rooms and windows that caught the morning light. They rebuilt the barn and smokehouse, planted a garden, expanded the small herd of animals. And in the quiet evenings, when the day's work was done, Eliza would read aloud while Silas and Thomas listened, the 3 of them becoming the family none of them had ever really had. By the time the first snow fell again, the new cabin was finished and provisioned for winter. Standing on the porch, looking out at the valley transformed into winter beauty, Eliza marveled at how far she'd come. A year ago, she'd been nothing, owned, abused, discarded. Now she stood on land she'd helped claim, in a home she'd helped build, beside a man who'd taught her to value herself and a friend who'd learned the same hard lessons. She'd been forged by hardship into something stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. She'd learned to fight, to survive, to stand her ground against corruption and violence. She'd proven that worth wasn't something given by others. It was something you claimed for yourself. Silas came to stand beside her, his arm around her shoulders. The wound in his chest had healed to a scar that matched the one on his face, marks of survival, not defeat. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I'm home," Eliza replied simply. Finally, truly home. And as the snow began to fall, soft and silent, she knew it was true. Winter settled over Ridge's End like a familiar friend that year, the snow falling in patterns Eliza had learned to read. Heavy flakes meant more to come, while light powder signaled clear skies ahead. She stood at the new cabin's window, watching the valley transform into that pristine landscape she'd come to love, and felt a contentment she'd never imagined possible. Behind her, Thomas was teaching Silas a complicated card game he'd learned from miners in Colorado, their good-natured arguing filling the warm space with life and laughter. The new cabin was larger than the old one, with a proper kitchen, separate sleeping quarters, and a main room that could comfortably hold all 3 of them without anyone feeling cramped. "You're cheating," Silas accused, but there was humor in his voice. "I'm winning," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." Eliza smiled, turning from the window. 6 months had passed since that violent day in Iron Ridge, and they'd used every one of those months to build something stronger than what had been lost. But she knew their peace was fragile, built on hope and hard work, and the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. The knock on the door came 3 days before Christmas, sharp and urgent in the mountain silence. All 3 of them went still, hands moving instinctively toward weapons that were never far from reach. They'd learned the hard way that unexpected visitors in the high country rarely brought good news. Silas answered the door with his rifle held ready, but relaxed when he saw Deputy Cobb standing on the porch, snow coating his shoulders.
This story
and his
was
horse
posted
steaming
on the
behind
channel
him.
west of Betrayal.
"Cobb,"
Please
Silas
do not
said, lowering
repost
the
it
weapon.
in any form.
"What brings you all the way up here?" "Trouble," Cobb replied, his face grim. "Can I come in? This isn't a conversation for an open doorway." They gathered around the table, and Eliza poured coffee while Cobb warmed his hands by the fire. The deputy looked older than he had 6 months ago, like the weight of his choices had carved new lines into his face. "Rourke escaped," Cobb said without preamble. The coffee pot nearly slipped from Eliza's hands. "What? How?" 3 nights ago, Cobb explained, his jaw tight with anger. "He had help. 2 men we never identified from the original robbery crew. They killed the night guard, broke Rourke out, and disappeared into the territories. The territorial marshal has men searching, but Rourke knows this country too well. He could be anywhere." Or he could be coming here, Silas said quietly. Cobb nodded. That's what I'm worried about. Before he escaped, Rourke was talking about revenge. He blames you three for everything. His arrest, his reputation being destroyed, the fact that he'll hang if he's caught. The man I knew was calculating and smart. The man who escaped is desperate and has nothing left to lose. Thomas had gone pale. So he'll come after us. I think it's likely, Cobb confirmed. And I'm not the only one. The territorial marshal wanted me to warn you, offer you protective custody in Denver until Rourke's recaptured. No, Eliza said immediately. We're not running. We built this place with our own hands, made it a home. I won't abandon it because Rourke can't accept that he lost. Silas looked at her, something like pride warming his pale eyes. Eliza's right. We stand our ground, but we prepare for what's coming. Cobb stayed for 2 more hours, sharing everything he knew about Rourke's escape and the men helping him. When he finally left, promising to send word if the search parties found anything, the cabin felt colder despite the roaring fire. He's going to come, Thomas said into the silence. Rourke doesn't know how to let go of anything. He'll want to finish what he started in Iron Ridge. Then we'll be ready, Silas replied, already moving to check their ammunition stores. We've got the advantage of terrain and preparation. Rourke may be desperate, but desperation makes men sloppy. They spent the next week fortifying their position. Silas showed them how to set tripwires in the approaches to the valley, how to create defensive positions that provided cover and clear firing lines. They stockpiled ammunition, firewood, and supplies in case they ended up under siege. Eliza found herself thinking about the girl she'd been a year ago, how that girl would have hidden and hoped for rescue. But she wasn't that person anymore. She checked and rechecked her rifle, made sure the spare ammunition was where she could reach it quickly, and when she caught sight of herself in the small mirror Silas had bought her, she barely recognized the woman looking back, hard-eyed, capable, ready for violence if it came to her door. You scared? Thomas asked her one evening as they worked together to organize supplies. Terrified, Eliza admitted. But being scared doesn't mean being helpless. I learned that from Silas. Fear is just information, a signal to prepare. It's what you do with it that matters. The attack came on Christmas Eve, during the hour just before dawn when the world was darkest and human vigilance was at its lowest. Eliza was on watch, sitting by the window with a blanket around her shoulders and a rifle across her knees when she saw movement at the tree line. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess what her instincts were screaming. They're here, she said quietly, and both men were instantly awake and armed. Silas moved to the window beside her, peering into the darkness. How many? I saw 3 shapes, but there could be more. They're approaching from the east, using the rocks for cover. Smart, Silas muttered. That's the route with the best cover and the steepest approach. Harder for us to get clear shots. He turned to Thomas. Check the west approach. If they're smart, they'll try to hit us from 2 directions. Thomas moved to the back window, and seconds later his curse confirmed Silas's prediction. 2 more coming from the west. They're trying to box us in. 5 against 3, Eliza said, surprised by how steady her voice was. But we have better position and we know this ground. And we're fighting for our home, Silas added. That counts for something. The first shot shattered the eastern window, glass exploding inward. Eliza dropped below the sill, her heart hammering, then rose just enough to sight along her rifle. She could see the muzzle flash from the shooter's position and returned fire. 3 quick shots that sent the attacker diving for cover. Silas Vane! Rourke's voice echoed across the valley, distorted by distance and rage. You should have stayed out of my business. Now you're going to watch everyone you care about die before I finish you. Big talk from a man hiding in the rocks, Silas shouted back. You want revenge? Come take it. Stop hiding behind hired guns and face us yourself. The response was a volley of gunfire that tore through the cabin's walls. Wood splintered, glass shattered, and Eliza felt a bullet pass so close to her head that she felt the wind of its passage. She returned fire, forcing herself to aim carefully despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. Thomas was shooting from the back window, his shots measured and precise. They're trying to work around to the barn, he called out. If they get the animals, we lose our mobility. I'll go, Eliza said, already moving. No, Silas started, but she cut him off. You can't run on that chest wound, and Thomas needs to keep pressure on the west approach. I'm the logical choice. She didn't wait for permission, just grabbed her rifle and the spare ammunition belt, then slipped out through the side door they'd built specifically for this kind of emergency. The cold hit her like a fist, but she ignored it, running low and fast toward the barn. A shot kicked up snow near her feet, and she dove behind a water trough, splinters exploding where bullets struck wood. She could see the shooter now, one of Rourke's men, positioned behind a boulder about 50 yards out. Eliza breathed, aimed, and fired. The man went down, and she didn't let herself think about whether he was dead or wounded, just kept moving toward the barn. She reached it and threw open the door, immediately checking the animals. The horse was wild-eyed with fear, the mule stamping nervously, but they were unharmed. She began saddling the horse with shaking hands, knowing they might need a fast escape if things went badly. That's when she heard footsteps behind her, the crunch of boots on snow. She spun, rifle coming up, and found herself face to face with one of Rourke's accomplices, a scarred man with dead eyes and a gun pointed directly at her heart. "Drop it," he ordered. Eliza's mind raced. She was too close to shoot. He'd kill her before she could aim. But surrendering meant death anyway, just slower. She saw it in his eyes, the same cold calculation she'd seen in predators before they struck. So she dropped the rifle, but not in surrender. She dropped it onto the man's foot, and when he jerked back in reflexive pain, she grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the stall and drove the tines into his shoulder with all the strength desperation and survival gave her. The man screamed and his gun went off, the bullet going wide. Eliza wrenched the pitchfork free and swung it like a club, catching him across the temple. He went down hard, and she snatched up her rifle, her whole body shaking. She'd just fought a man hand to hand and won. The realization hit her like lightning. She wasn't just capable of defending herself, she was dangerous when cornered. All those months of training, of learning to trust her strength, had transformed her into someone who could survive violence and emerge victorious. The gunfire from the cabin had intensified. Eliza led the horse outside and tied it to a post where it could be reached quickly if needed, then sprinted back toward the fight. Silas was bleeding from a cut on his cheek where splinters had torn skin, but he was still shooting, still coordinated. Thomas had moved to a different window, trying to keep multiple attackers pinned down. "Two down," Eliza reported, sliding into position beside Silas. "Maybe three if that one in the barn doesn't wake up." "That leaves Rourke, and at least one more," Silas said, reloading. "They'll try something desperate soon. They're losing, and they know it." He was right. Minutes later, fire blossomed at the barn's roof. Someone had thrown a torch, trying to burn them out by destroying their supplies and escape route. "No," Eliza breathed, watching flames lick at the structure they'd worked so hard to build. "Let it burn," Silas said harshly. "The cabin's what matters. The barn can be rebuilt." But Eliza was already moving, grabbing blankets, and the bucket they kept for emergencies. If the barn burned completely, they'd lose everything stored there: food for the animals, tools they couldn't replace, supplies that would take months to restock. She ran toward the burning building, aware of bullets cutting the air around her but focused only on reaching the flames. She beat at them with a wet blanket, trying to smother the fire before it could really take hold. "Eliza, get back!" Thomas's shout was desperate, but she ignored it, fighting the fire with the same fierce determination she'd brought to every other battle. Then rough hands grabbed her from behind, spinning her around, and she found herself staring into Amos Rourke's rage-twisted face. "You destroyed everything," he snarled, his grip on her arm crushing. "My reputation, my power, my future, all because you couldn't keep
This
your
story
mouth
was
shut.
posted on the channel
You
west
destroyed
of
yourself."
Betrayal.
Eliza
Please do not
spat back,
repost
trying
it
to wrench
in any
free.
form.
"You murdered innocent men for money. You wore a badge and betrayed everything it stood for. I just made sure people knew the truth." Rourke's other hand came up, holding a knife that gleamed in the firelight. "Then you can die knowing you were right. I hope it's enough comfort when you're bleeding out in the snow." The knife came down, but Eliza twisted, her months of training taking over. She couldn't fully dodge. The blade sliced across her ribs, bright pain cutting through the adrenaline, but she managed to grab Rourke's wrist, using his own momentum to unbalance him. They went down together in the snow, struggling for control of the knife. Rourke was stronger, but Eliza was fighting for her life, for her home, for the future she'd clawed out of nothing. She wasn't going to let him take it away. Her free hand found a rock in the snow, and she swung it with everything she had, catching Rourke across the temple. His grip loosened, and she tore free, scrambling backward. The rifle shot came from the cabin, and Rourke jerked, red blooming across his shoulder. Silas was on the porch, his face a mask of cold fury. His rifle aimed for a second shot. "You don't get to touch her," Silas said, his voice carrying across the snow. "You don't get to hurt anyone else. Your war is with me, Rourke. Face me." Rourke staggered to his feet, blood streaming from his shoulder and his temple, his knife still clutched in his hand. Behind him, the barn's flames were dying. Eliza's efforts had worked, the fire smothered before it could consume the structure. "This isn't over," Rourke gasped, backing away. "I'll come back. I'll keep coming until—" "No, you won't," a new voice interrupted. Deputy Cobb emerged from the tree line, flanked by the territorial marshal and 6 armed men. They'd been tracking Rourke, following the trail he'd left in his obsessive pursuit of revenge. "Amos Rourke," the marshal announced formally, "you're under arrest for murder, theft, assault, and escaping lawful custody. Drop the weapon." For a moment, Rourke stood frozen, his eyes darting between the armed men surrounding him, between the cabin where Silas and Thomas stood ready to fight, and Eliza in the snow, bloodied but unbroken. He saw in that moment what Eliza had seen months ago. He'd lost. Not just this fight, but everything. His power, his freedom, his life. The law had finally caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to run. The knife dropped from his fingers into the snow. The marshal's men took Rourke into custody, binding his hands while a deputy tended to his wounds. The other attackers were rounded up, 2 dead, 3 captured, all of them facing murder charges for the guard they'd killed during the prison break. "We got word you were under attack from the tripwire signals," Cobb explained as Eliza pressed a cloth to her bleeding ribs. "We rode through the night to get here." "Cutting it pretty close," Thomas observed, but there was gratitude in his voice. "We got here in time," Cobb replied. "That's what matters." The territorial marshal approached Silas, his weathered face solemn. "Mr. Vane, Miss Crow, Mr. Whitley, the territory owes you a debt. Again. If there's anything we can do, leave us alone," Silas said bluntly. "We've done our part. We testified. We brought down a corrupt sheriff. We helped you recapture him. Now we just want to live our lives in peace." The marshal nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. Official records will show that you cooperated fully with the law and are owed the territory's gratitude. No one will bother you up here again. You have my word." "See that they don't," Silas replied. It took 3 hours to clean up the aftermath. Bodies were removed, statements were taken, and the law enforcement contingent finally rode out, taking Rourke and his surviving accomplices back to face justice. This time, the marshal promised, Rourke would be held in the territorial prison under maximum security until his execution. When they were finally alone again, the 3 of them stood in the cabin, looking at the damage. Bullet holes in the walls, shattered windows, blood on the floor, evidence of how close they'd come to losing everything. "We can fix it," Eliza said, looking at the destruction. "We've rebuilt before. We can do it again." "Are you all right?" Silas asked, gently examining the knife wound on her ribs. It was shallow, more painful than dangerous, but it would leave another scar. "I'm fine," Eliza assured him. "Better than fine, actually. I fought Rourke hand to hand and held my own. I'm not afraid of him anymore. I'm not afraid of anything." Silas pulled her close, carefully avoiding her injury, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "Fierce and fearless. Everything I knew you could be." Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. I'll start cleaning up. You two take a moment." When they were alone, Silas cupped Eliza's face in his scarred hands and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I almost lost you today. When I saw Rourke grab you, when I saw that knife," his voice broke. "I realized I couldn't live in a world without you in it." "You won't have to," Eliza promised. "We're both survivors, Silas. We don't give up, and we don't give in. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." He kissed her then, deep and fierce. A claim and a promise rolled into one. And Eliza kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into that connection. Love and gratitude, passion and partnership, the bone-deep knowledge that she'd finally found where she belonged. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need protection or because convention demands it, but because I want to build a life with you, a real partnership, equal and true." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears, the kind she'd never thought she'd shed. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." The next months passed in a blur of rebuilding and healing. They repaired the cabin's damage, replaced the shattered windows, patched the bullet holes. The barn's partially burned roof was rebuilt stronger than before. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and covering the valley in wildflowers that seemed to celebrate survival. True to the marshal's word, no one from the territorial government bothered them. News reached them through occasional traders that Rourke had been tried, convicted, and hanged for his crimes. Margaret Crow had disappeared entirely, last seen boarding a stage to California, running from the shame of having raised a daughter who'd become a territorial hero. Eliza felt nothing about her mother's departure except relief. That chapter was closed, burned away like winter snow in the spring sun. They were married in June, with Thomas standing witness and a circuit preacher performing the ceremony on the cabin's porch. It was simple and perfect. No fancy dress or elaborate celebration, just two people who'd survived hell together promising to build heaven with their own hands. That summer, Thomas announced his intention to file a claim on the adjacent valley, to build his own homestead while staying close enough to help with the shared work and provide mutual support. They celebrated his decision, knowing that their small community was growing into something resilient and lasting. By the time the first snow fell again, marking 2 full years since Eliza had climbed into these mountains as a frightened, broken girl, Ridge's End had transformed into a thriving mountain homestead. They'd expanded the cabin again, adding a proper workshop where Silas could work leather and wood during the winter months. The barn housed 4 horses now, a growing herd of goats, and even some chickens that Thomas had brought up from the valley. One evening in November, Eliza stood on the porch watching the sun set over the peaks, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly where new life was growing. Behind her, through the window, she could hear Silas and Thomas arguing good-naturedly about something, their voices warm with the easy affection of family. She thought about the girl who'd stood in the mud of Iron Ridge, waiting to be sold like livestock. That girl had believed herself worthless because that's what the world had told her. She'd accepted abuse as normal, had thought survival was the best she could hope for. But that girl was gone, transformed through hardship into someone stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. Eliza had learned that worth wasn't something others gave you. It was something you claimed for yourself through courage and perseverance. She'd learned that home wasn't a place, but a feeling of safety and belonging, built with people who saw your value even when you couldn't see it yourself. She'd learned, most importantly, that the worst moments of your life didn't have to define you. You could survive them, learn from them, and build something beautiful from the ashes they left behind. The door opened behind her, and Silas emerged with a blanket to wrap around her shoulders. "Cold out here," he observed, settling beside her. "Beautiful, though," Eliza replied, leaning into his warmth. They stood together watching darkness claim the valley, comfortable in the silence that only comes when two people truly know each other. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not a threat anymore, just part of the mountain's voice, no more frightening than wind or snow. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked eventually. Eliza smiled, placing her hand over his on her belly, over the future they'd
This
created
story was
together.
posted on the channel
"I'm
west
thinking
of
about
the
how
trail.
far we've come.
Please do not
About how I
repost
started
it in
with
any
nothing,
form.
less than nothing, and ended up with everything that matters." "We did that," Silas corrected gently. "Together." "Together," Eliza agreed. "And that's the best part. I'm not alone anymore. I'll never be alone again." She turned to look at him, this scarred, fierce man who'd seen past her broken exterior to the strength underneath, who'd given her the tools and space to become herself. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for believing I was worth saving even when I didn't believe it." "You saved yourself," Silas replied, cupping her face with one calloused hand. "I just gave you the opportunity. Everything else, the strength, the courage, the fierce determination to survive, that was always yours. You just needed to find it. Eliza kissed him, pouring everything she felt into that simple gesture. When they pulled apart, the stars were emerging overhead, brilliant in the clear mountain air. "Come on," Silas said, guiding her back toward the cabin's warm glow. "Thomas is making stew, and you need to eat for two now." As they stepped inside, into the warmth and light and laughter of home, Eliza felt the last piece of her old pain finally release its hold. She'd been discarded, abandoned, treated as worthless by the world below. But she'd climbed into these mountains and found everything she needed: purpose, partnership, and the bone-deep knowledge of her own worth. She'd been tested by wolves and winter, by corrupt lawmen, and her own mother's hatred. She'd faced down death more than once and emerged victorious every time. She'd learned to fight, to survive, to thrive in a place where the weak perished and only the strong endured. And now, standing in the home she'd built with her own hands, beside the man who'd taught her to value herself, carrying new life that would grow up knowing only love and strength, Eliza Vane, no longer Crow, never Crow again, understood that redemption wasn't something given to you. It was something you earned, one hard choice at a time, one moment of courage following another, until the broken pieces of what you'd been were forged into something unbreakable. She'd been thrown away in the mud, discarded as worthless. She'd risen from that mud, climbed mountains, and claimed a life worth living. That was her story. That was her triumph. And no one, ever again, could take it away. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the valley in white. But inside Ridge's End, the fire burned warm and bright, keeping the darkness at bay and lighting the way forward into whatever tomorrow would bring. And Eliza, who'd started with nothing, stood surrounded by everything that mattered: love, home, family, and the fierce joy of knowing exactly who she was and what she was worth. The girl in the mud was gone forever. The woman who'd risen from those ashes was here to stay.